All right, guys, here today to talk about another president. We are dealing with James Madison today, kind of looking at the high points of his presidency, his life, his legacy, uh, and also just we're trying to understand how their faith played a role in their presidency and how that affected maybe the Union or how the Union affected the presidency, whatever. We're trying to look at that as we go through all these different presidents. So Madison comes in. Um, After Jefferson, right? He was already in the Jefferson administration.
Right.
So
Secretary of State,
that's correct. So he's
springboard to the presidency.
there you go.
Right.
Exactly. And that seems to have been the pattern so far.
Right.
You know, you were either one of those two, you were vice president or secretary of state, and it helps you to get into that role yourself.
Right.
So anyway, we're in Virginia again. It seems like many of the early presidents, they all come from Virginia. And it makes sense. There was this sort of royal charter that begins this thing anyway,
Right.
and so these guys are, I don't know, would you call them, what would you call them? I mean, elite? I don't know how to frame that.
Landed gentry.
Okay.
Landed gentry. I mean, that's what they would call themselves. So.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, something along those lines, and so that the gentleman, right, sort of educated with some money or some means or some sort of legacy in their family that led them to this point. They weren't necessarily the poor farm boy who became president. The American dream, in that sense, is not
They're a little ways
necessarily.
off on that.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
It happens, but not quite yet.
Yeah.
We didn't get there yet. At this point, it's still sort of it's very English in the sense of the way that things are moving. But so Madison again grows up in Virginia, and
Well, thinking about that,
uh-huh,
Virginia, largest population of
hmm
any of the 13 states, and that coupled with the Three-Fifths Compromise means they have the largest electorate.
yeah, that makes sense. Well, and their blueprints, especially with what we're going to talk about today, I think with Madison, it sort of sets the stage for what's going to happen federally, because Virginia becomes sort of the model,
Right.
right? I mean,
What's Virginia plan, which we're going to get
yeah,
into.
that's right.
Right.
This sort of Virginia plan and the way that things went down there, that's how it went forward in the Constitution anyway,
Right.
because of Madison essentially, and Jefferson too, but
And Washington also.
yeah, Washington too, at least his views on how
Right.
leadership should be and all. But so he grows up Anglican, as you would if you're any person in Virginia,
Would start Anglican.
you're going to start off Anglican. I mean,
Right.
there are some little
Strong Baptist movement, but it's slow.
there are, but there's a problem with the Baptist movement there,
Right.
and we'll get into that in a bit too, and that affects Madison as far as religious liberty is concerned.
Right.
So anyway, he starts off there in Virginia. He's Anglican, at least baptized that way, from what we know. Attends, and he has this, Christian sentiment about him, like pretty much everybody did at that time. And he goes off to New Jersey College, which would become Princeton University.
Isn't it called Kings at the very beginning?
I think it may have
Kings
been, but at his
College.
point, it was New Jersey,
Right.
and then and it was being led by John Witherspoon,
Right.
who was the president. And Madison and Witherspoon had some close friendship, some ties there, where he was under Witherspoon's tutelage almost directly, or literally directly. And Witherspoon is Presbyterian, right? Which that's what Princeton began as.
Right.
Princeton is a
What
Presbyterian institution.
what years are we? Madison have gone to Princeton.
Yeah, good question.
Well, I
I
mean,
think
safe to assume
it's
pre-revolution.
70, yeah, it's pre-revolution, but
So
so it's still everything has, yeah, it's pre-revolution because Witherspoon and Madison's relationship happened before the Declaration of Independence,
right, right, right.
because Witherspoon signs the Declaration of Independence
Okay.
after knowing
Madison.
James Madison. So after their
Right.
interaction.
He So the battle that takes place at Princeton would have happened later.
That's correct.
Just a little anecdotal note is
That's
that
right.
the battle actually occurred on the campus,
Hmm.
and there was a painting of King George that a cannonball supposedly actually went right through the head of. So kind of an interesting thing.
Really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. So, uh, what would we say, as far as Madison, pre-presidency, his claim to fame?
Starting out, he's the youngest elected congressman
Mhm.
in the, not elected, excuse me, the youngest member of the Continental Congress.
That's right.
Right.
Okay. And what about his experience in Virginia? Because I think that sort of kicks off pretty much, I mean, everything that most people know about him, I
It's
guess.
been a minute since I've looked that up. I would think the House of
It,
Burgesses at some point.
yeah. Yeah, and then eventually his the problem is trying to come up with a state constitution,
Right.
right?
Right.
And he and Jefferson are batting things around about how this thing's going to happen. Um, but there's a problem in Virginia, and for that matter, as we've discussed with other presidencies and always leading to today, an issue with persecution
Right.
that's happening.
Well, not only persecution, but being taxed by the state church.
Correct.
And when you look into what Madison and Jefferson are going to be talking about with that statute for religious freedom,
Hmm.
there's a hard angle for the first part of the what we the First Amendment, that first part
Yeah.
where it's that separation clause
Hmm.
that if you look at the Virginia statute for religious freedom, it's more heavily on that end than it is the free exercise.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah, it's about limiting that power upon it's stopping them from infiltrating the government.
that's right.
Yeah, it literally is, and that is the model that would be used. The reason I bring that up is because uh, there's videos going around social media right now. I know Charlie Kirk comes out and has all this,
I watched one of his the other day.
yeah, about how
Yeah,
many of the, how the U.S. was formed by Christian principles, and I don't deny the basics of that because
right.
that's generally true. There
There's
was
some brotherly kindness going in there,
That's
definitely.
right. That's right. And but he was making a point about the various state constitutions,
Right.
and because it was brought up that the Constitution doesn't have the word God in it, right? The Declaration does essentially, but the Constitution doesn't. And so therefore, there's no Christianity, and he doesn't just go to bat to say that Christianity was present, but that it was the force that created it, which because he's leaning on, I think his point was of trying to we should go back to that model. And the problem was what he does is he cites the various state constitutions in doing that. But that's actually what Madison was fighting against, were the state churches, and
Right.
which is why we end up having to have the First Amendment in the Constitution to begin with.
Though Madison becomes sort of the champion of the anti-federalist Democratic Republican Party,
Hmm.
he starts out very much Federalist.
Hmm.
And whenever he's involved with that side of things, he never is a states' rights guy.
No.
He never goes there. Um, he was always federal power over state power.
Yeah.
Yeah, from the get-go.
Yeah.
And I don't think that even after becoming a Democratic Republican, I don't think that changed.
Well, and see, so his point was that because the majority of the state constitutions contain the word God and were founded on Christian principles literally in the document, that means that that's a heritage that we should go back to. And the problem that I have with what he's stating is that it's very misleading because it sounds like, that means there's this great utopia for Christianity, which it wasn't. It depended upon your particular persuasion
Right.
and where you lived, right? So
I mean, you have the idea from, John Winthrop going back with the city on a hill,
sure,
but they don't really turn into a city on a hill. They turn into a haven for people with like minds.
that's right.
But then when they start turning into Unitarians, I would say it would probably go a little more in that direction.
Sure, but that's a different story
Yeah,
then, right?
absolutely. And
Um,
I think the same similar things are happening in Virginia.
yeah.
Um,
Well, it absolutely is. So
yeah,
Madison ends up friends with several Baptist preachers, for instance, a dozen of which are in Culpeper jail
right.
for preaching without a license
Yeah.
simply because they're Baptist. And some of them are simply publishing tracts,
Hmm.
and you get arrested for that,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the thing that Charlie Kirk is going back and saying, this is such a good, beautiful thing that was happening there. It's absolutely a problem,
Yeah.
right? Because there's no, you have to have religious freedom in order for, there to be at least the kind of Christianity that he's actually reaching for,
Right.
right? It didn't exist. In fact, so Virginia, you were Anglican or it wasn't tolerated.
Yeah.
And all of the state constitutions, they did contain this, but they also had religious tests for office.
Right.
You had to pay taxes, as you said before, to a church that,
Churches in Virginia had tobacco points for the tax.
that's right. You're paying the salary. You're paying the salary of the ministers of a church that you may not attend, and you may not even agree with their doctrines.
In large case, you don't, and you're still paying it.
That's right, because it
Right.
doesn't make a difference. You have to pay it no matter what.
Right.
The only states that sort of were not really in that camp,
Your middle colonies,
yeah,
Pennsylvania and
Pennsylvania, Rhode Island,
New York,
New York, yeah, and
somewhat Jersey,
that's right. No, and
which is where he's going to go to college. Kind of interesting.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So anyway, he has this relationship with John Witherspoon, as I said, and so it seems like maybe some of that Presbyterian connection kind of rubbed off on him a bit because in some of the letters that because he doesn't write as much, he's not as prolific as Thomas Jefferson was.
Right.
He doesn't write as many letters. He does write letters, but a lot of times they're to address actual issues and problems.
I
They're
would
not
say he's
personal in
prolific in a
nature.
different way. Like
He's prolific in the
he's a
government
note. Yeah,
documents.
he's a note taker too.
That's
He
correct.
keeps meticulous notes.
But he's using terms like providence, for instance, which is not out of line for just about any of these thinkers in the Enlightenment period. Anyway,
Right.
like Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have a problem with that,
Right.
even though I wouldn't put him in a boxed in Christian camp. I still would feel like he would be comfortable with that term
Yeah.
with no problem. So he's using that term though, which is more of that puritanical mindset of
Right.
that becomes Presbyterianism.
And I think Jefferson, going back to Jefferson, because we talked about him at length, but
Yeah.
going back to Jefferson, if you think about when he's writing the Declaration to when he's president,
Hmm.
there's definitely a little bit more Christianity prior to
Prior to the presidency.
prior to the presidency.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that.
Because Franklin makes him take wording out
Hmm.
that he had written in the words sacred and the
Hmm.
word
Hmm.
I can't remember the other one at the moment, but it's definitely a more churchy word that he makes him pull. In fact, Franklin told him smacks of the pulpit.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so
Which I think is what he was going for because he does have that mindset that he wants to follow the tenets of Jesus, right?
right,
And so you can see that sort of, in his writing and
right.
his actions, really.
Well,
But
and also starting out Anglican, he probably had a little bit more of an Orthodox theology going into that,
yeah,
and then over time, just like Washington and others, it started to kind of maybe wax a little bit pluralistic,
yeah,
So
yeah. Well, I'm trying to see what year this was. Um, okay, so 1774, Madison writes to William Bradford. Okay, because he's angry about religious persecution.
that had been the governor at the time.
Correct.
Yeah, 74.
In Massachusetts. So there was problems there and all the way through into Virginia. So anyway, he says this in the letter. That diabolical hell-conceived principle of persecution rages among some. And to their eternal infamy, the clergy can furnish their quota of imps for such business. This vexes me the worst of anything whatever. There are at this time in the adjacent country not less than 5 or 6 well meaning men in close jail for publishing their religious sentiments, which in the main are very orthodox. I have neither patience to hear, talk, or think of anything relative to this matter, for I have squabbled and scolded, abused and ridiculed so long to little purpose that I am without common patience. So I must beg you to pity me and pray for the liberty of the conscience of all. And he's what he's bemoaning at that moment was a series of Baptist preachers that had been
Right.
jailed in
And he's
Culpeper.
known for being pretty genial too. So that is strong language for Madison.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's like him in a rage.
Yeah.
um,
That's his most intense.
yeah, and one of these fellows, by the way, that's in jail is a Baptist preacher named Elijah Craig.
Right.
Okay, and
Is it the whiskey?
yes, it is. He's the same. He's famous for a different reason later, and his name still exists on bottles everywhere. But because he had begun to take, he was from Bourbon, Kentucky. Okay, and so credited with creating bourbon.
The origin of it.
Yeah,
Which would explain why I
in
saw that.
in aging it in charred oak barrels,
Okay.
and that's what he was doing. But anyway, also a Baptist preacher.
Right. Well,
Um,
aren't the big three all Baptist preachers?
there's a connection some kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, there was either connection to either alcohol or tobacco
Right.
to most of the early churches, and I mean, it was the way you made money.
Right.
You had to do something like that. But nevertheless, he was famous for that reason. But Elijah Craig had been jailed at least twice in Culpeper, and Madison personally knew him,
Right.
and he had talked to him about his grievances. Um, and you end up with this, you end up with the bill that Jefferson writes in Virginia that Madison continues to put forward to try to get passed in the state
Right.
of Virginia, which is the one that you mentioned earlier, right? But it takes like 10 years or something. It's a long
Right.
process of making that happen. But I think his personal experience and the stories that he heard about persecutions that were happening, uh, it motivated him. Not only did Jefferson motivate him to do it, he was motivated by the
His
personal,
personal feelings about it. Right.
yeah, and his own questioning. People questioning his own beliefs, and I think he felt that pressure as well. And that this wasn't going to work out well. You know, with that level of persecution and questioning that was happening in these early states. So, fixing the Virginia Constitution essentially.
Right.
Um,
I think if we compare the two, Massachusetts and Virginia, I think the persecution was a little bit stiffer up in
it was
Massachusetts,
worse in Massachusetts, no
but the
doubt.
Virginia version is more economic.
Mhm.
It's more,
Well, I just
like
want
you
you to pay a
said,
license.
right,
It was about give me money,
right,
and I bet that that there would be people that would say, well, things haven't changed all that much, right? Permits to building permits or whatever, you got a permit for this, permit for that, and permission from the government to do whatever on your property, and that's kind of the same kind of thing because even if you were going to, let's just say, preach at your own home at a private home, you still had to have a license.
right,
It wasn't about the public space. It was about a license.
right,
Now in say Massachusetts, it was more than that. It was the differences in doctrinal issues that
right.
led to people being not only jailed but beaten, whipped, fined. I mean, it was
Exiled and
terrible.
initially burned at the stake and hung.
Yeah.
Um, that's early, early, early. But when
Hmm.
we start talking about like Ann Hutchinson or someone like that, they're
Hmm.
banishing them by that point.
Yeah.
And where are they heading? Further south.
Yeah.
Rhode Island at first. And
That's right. So this uh, Virginia experience, as it's known, right, gives him an understanding of maybe the way to go federally and how to fix the issues because he was dealing with those problems in his own state. And as you said, they weren't as severe as they were in other places.
Right.
But he still saw fit that it needed to be fixed in his own state.
Not as severe, but just as controlling.
That's
And I
correct.
think that's where he saw the problem is how much
Hmm.
control the church had,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, because I was reading about him originally, and originally he doesn't think that we should delineate any rights at all. Um, he thought at first, he said this was his problem with it, at least the way I
Are you
understand it.
talking about listing them? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
he didn't want to list them because he felt like if you list a right, then at some point somebody's going to think of that, well, we give you that right,
Yeah.
basically, that
Yeah.
the government
Like
gives
a
you that right.
privilege
It's a
rather than right.
privilege,
Yeah.
and only the ones listed are the ones that you have.
And from a strict constructionist like Jefferson's view, that's actually pretty accurate.
Exactly.
But Jefferson would have seen it even against his own view that the idea is to have these listed so those are protected.
Hmm.
And then you end up with like the Ninth Amendment where
Hmm.
if even if it's not listed, as long as it's not written the other way, it
Yes.
is protected.
Well, and that was what Madison suggested in the beginning was that
Right.
if if in other words we create this document or these laws and if it isn't mentioned here,
Yeah.
then you have a right to do it
Right.
because the government isn't interfering in those
Right.
things because we have not said that they could.
We've limited them.
We've limited the government
Yeah.
where if you flip it, it's almost like flipped on its head where the people are being limited by the government
Right.
rather than the government being limited by the people.
And that goes back to that whole social contract argument and who's initiating it and what
That's right.
exactly does it mean. Madison would agree that, the people are surrendering some of their rights
Hmm.
in order to arrange for the social contract and to allow government to rule,
Hmm.
but only to the point that the government turns around and does what it's supposed to do by the people,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that everything Madison is about is a stronger government, but one that does its job,
Yeah.
and ironically, talking about not wanting to delineate the rights, he's the one
He's
who
the one who
does it.
does.
He's the one who ends up doing it.
Well, yeah, as I say, he came sort of full circle on that,
Right.
right? That I think he
But he did it in such a way that it accomplishes both of what he was aiming
it
at.
does, and I think it set out a path to be able to carve out new rights with new amendments, as you
Right.
suggested, and that
Well, the experience of compromising with others, because that entire constitutional convention, that's what it is.
mhm,
And that experience of compromising with others and learning how to make it work, that affects his whole thing,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, and so that experience, like I said, Virginia carried over to the federal side. It helped him. In fact, why is he picked? I mean, does it seem like he's the guy, because
He's a
of
mover. He's personally advocating, like,
for the Constitution in general, I guess is
right,
what I'm saying. Yeah.
in the same way that Hamilton in New York is doing.
Hmm.
Um, and interestingly enough, something about religion in that whole setting, Franklin made a movement to have prayer at the beginning of the meeting, and it was voted down by the delegates. And Hamilton is quoted as saying something to the effect of, um, the gentlemen here are adults and can conduct business without the approval of foreign dignitaries.
Nice.
So
Yeah.
kind of interesting because Hamilton's generally considered one of the more religious leaning, at least,
Uh-huh.
you know.
Yeah. So it's almost like he had in his head too this idea of a separation in that sense.
Right.
At least to that extent.
Right.
Or he didn't like
And so
how the prayer was going to be offered
you
or
think of
something.
Hamilton and Jefferson, but you also think of Hamilton and Madison. And at first, they're kind of cohorts in a
Hmm.
way, but then they sort of become polar opposites.
Well, I think I think Jefferson is the elephant in the room here, right?
Definitely.
Because of Jefferson and Madison's
The greatest
compromises and
political,
working together.
yeah, greatest political
That duo.
tag team
Yeah.
of all time,
Hmm.
essentially. If
Yeah, because
Hamilton had had a guy in his corner like that, he might have done better.
he might have. Yeah, because I feel like that when one couldn't do it, the other one did. I mean, because it's not like Madison couldn't have written a bill for religious liberty.
Oh, he probably would have been the better legal writer.
Yeah,
Jefferson, the more eloquent writer. You know,
yeah. So Jefferson writes it anyway, though, and then Madison introduces his bill. Like, so there's this sort of, you know, back and forth that happens with them.
right,
And I think maybe even in the Constitution itself and the ideas that are present there. But you see a lot of these people over time, their views sort of change because of their experience in this world, right? Because
right.
we talked about that before with Jefferson, where there's a different character in the Declaration than there is by the time you end up with
Oh
the
yeah, I mean,
Constitution.
when he's writing the Declaration, he's a kind of a kind of a revolutionary thinker. Like
Hmm.
just
Give everybody every right,
pretty radical,
yeah,
um,
which in
and probably a tad bit religious in that.
yeah.
You know,
But by the time it's Constitution time, he had backed off of some of those ideas, at least not.
he's a statesman at this point. I mean,
Yes.
he's yeah,
He wasn't as revolutionary with it, I guess. He's more willing to compromise about some of these issues. And
right,
he doesn't become, obviously, a Federalist, but he's affected by them. And he sees the need for some unifying control
right.
in some way.
Of course, Jefferson's initial term in office, I want to say it was over 1,000 that he fired,
Yeah.
and he just fires a bunch of people.
He wasn't afraid to do that
Yeah.
or to use impeachment.
When Madison's coming into office, that's already been taken care of. So
Yeah. So what's the next? So let's say, let's jump a little bit
so
here.
we got him at we got him to Princeton.
Yeah, we got him at
So
Princeton.
he graduates from Princeton. What's his? Do we know what his study was?
No, I think it was law or
I think it
something.
was
That,
law. I think you were.
but so he moves from Princeton. He's involved in the Constitution. I'm going to jump past it if we
Okay, so you
can.
want to get past the Constitution.
Yeah, I want to get
So
past that.
let's go ahead and set the groundwork for that so that we know where we're coming from. Madison is widely considered to be the father of the Constitution.
Hmm.
He writes what becomes known as the Virginia Plan.
Hmm.
He doesn't present it, and I think largely because he doesn't want to be seen as the only voice.
Yeah,
He
he wants it
has
to be a group effort.
right. Edmund Randolph, of the governor of Virginia, actually presents the plan,
Hmm.
but it's Madison's writing.
Yeah.
And then what we end up in the Constitution is mostly the Virginia plan with a few compromise additions,
Hmm.
such as the Great Compromise, where you add, an equal Senate, proportional
Hmm.
House representatives.
Proportional for the House of
Right.
Representatives.
It
Yeah,
would have been proportional in both under Madison
yeah,
because he just felt that was fair that you represent all the people.
yeah,
He didn't see the idea of giving a big state more power as being a bad thing if all the people were represented.
yeah. If they were all there, well, especially at the time, I think because, like you said, Virginia was a high population state, so Virginia would have been fine.
They're good with it. Yeah,
Yeah,
plenty good
of
with it.
course they are.
7 of the states are good with it. It's
Yeah.
6 of the others that are holdouts on
Hmm.
that. So
Yeah, probably the lower population states.
for the most part, New York, whatever Jersey, and they kind of side together. But
Yeah, yeah. So let's move through that then into the transition to presidency.
okay,
Um,
so Madison gets the presidency at a rough point.
mhm.
Um, you're looking at what 1808 or it's the 1812,
1809.
1809. Okay, so we've had the Embargo Act in place 1807,
Hmm.
and then the Non-Intercourse Act sometime in 1808.
Hmm.
So we've cut off trade with the entire planet for a brief period of time.
Yeah,
It's Jefferson's biggest regret,
yeah,
to be honest. And so Madison's inheriting that government that the economy is in the shambles. The British are abusing us at every turn.
hmm. The British are also siding with Native Americans,
Yeah, they're inciting them
and in
to
fact,
bring
revving
a
them
war.
up
Right.
to go to war.
In
You
fact,
know,
we're going to have during the War of 1812, which was what we're going to get to.
it's really that's really what that
There
war
are
is.
multiple the Native American wars. I mean, the Creek War,
Yeah.
That's where Andrew Jackson
Remember
built
the
his thing.
Shawnee,
Yep.
um,
You have Tecumseh, of course.
Tecumseh, of
That's all
course.
going on.
Yeah, from the War of 1812, we end up with rather famous people that people may have heard their name, they may not even know what they did, but people like Tecumseh, and then you have a rising star that's going to be president later,
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew
Right.
Jackson,
Well,
the
William
Battle
Henry
of New
Harrison,
Orleans.
Tippecanoe.
That's true.
Yeah. You
William
get
Henry
several.
Harrison.
You get several out of that
Yeah,
situation.
yeah, but it really is a continuation of the revolt against the Great Britain,
Right.
as a colony. It's just a continuation of that
Well, and
essentially.
they were supposed to leave, according to the Treaty of Paris, they were supposed to leave their forts in the
Yeah.
Northwest Territory,
Hmm.
Detroit and such. They're supposed to leave that behind, and they never did because we didn't have the military or the power
Hmm.
to force them out.
Yeah.
And we owed them money, and so they were like, as long as you don't pay your debt, well, fine, we're not gonna
Yeah.
honor our side of it either.
Yeah. And you have so I guess we kind of have to talk about Madison and Native Americans now to
Okay.
get into the war, right? Because I don't know another way to do that because that's kind of the
Well,
War of 1812 is
the
relevant to that because he tries to be, I think, benevolent,
yeah, the impressment of
but
sailors thing is kind of a bigger thing in Madison's wheelhouse, but we'll get to that. So,
yeah, yeah.
um,
So the Native American tribes, like, what is he doing, or what's happening in the country that leads to this war, right? Because it's more than just that the British are
inciting it.
inciting it. I mean, there's a cause already.
So I think you start to see the beginnings of assimilation with Jefferson.
Hmm. And he
Assimilation
wants
seen as a good thing.
that's right, and Madison wants that too,
Right.
which is also what Washington wanted, right? In fact, Madison goes so far as assimilation. He wants intermarriage. He thinks people should mix with the Native Americans, intermarry.
Well, it explains the Cherokee 100%.
It does, and that way their culture fades away.
Yeah.
That is essentially what he wanted,
Right.
and then everybody becomes this new great
A
American
blended culture, so to
culture.
speak.
Yeah, but the public had a negative reaction to his statements about intermarriage.
Right.
That was a publicly it was a no go.
Yeah.
You know, but as what has happened with every other president so far,
You make the policy, settlers don't follow it, and then you have to come up with new policies.
exactly.
Yeah.
He did respect the fact that he his statements are that the Native Americans owned the property, that it was their property.
Right.
So he continued that tradition of we have to settle with them by treaty.
Right.
There's no other way to do
Well,
this.
a little bit of Roger Williams where you're paying them for the land, and
Yeah,
a little bit of William Penn where you're also working out some sort of mutual agreement.
yeah,
You know.
yeah. How can we move forward?
Right.
Like because we need this piece of property.
Right.
What do we do? Where do we go from here? And there was this, again, the treaties that are sort of being worked out. But
I think
but
when we look at the Northern War, we talk about Tecumseh particularly and the Shawnees and the United Tribes. He's trying to unite the tribes in opposition to the United States.
mhm,
And his idea is very much his own United States, but just, I guess, the Native American version versus the white version.
yeah.
Um,
But Tecumseh is an interesting individual in his own
he
right,
is. He
which
is.
we don't
There's
have
some
time to get
religious
into. We
overtones
don't
with
have to
that,
get
right?
into all that. I
His
think not
brother's
just
called
sort of,
the prophet.
not just sort of. He
Yeah.
becomes his own. He's sort of like a shaman.
Yeah. His brother literally is.
His brother is that, but
Yeah.
I think he tried to live that out in that,
Right.
but politician shaman, I guess, or warrior
Because
shaman.
the politics of it, it's basically that we're never going to overturn this unless
Mhm.
we resist.
Yeah.
And so that's really where he's not wrong.
If you just keep
He's
signing
not wrong.
treaties, we lost.
Yeah,
Basically.
he's not wrong. And
He
and the
isn't.
thing is, it's in opposition to the settlers, not Madison.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
um,
So because Madison, I think his personal feelings, sort of like others before, are pushed aside a bit
right.
to
Well, and you look at how some of that stuff
move
goes
ahead.
down because you're at war with Native Americans going back to 1809, like right
Mhm.
when Madison inherits the
That's
office.
right.
Um, and
It's too late.
that
It's
business with
already on
William Henry
fire.
Harrison, he's the governor of Indiana. He's not the president. He's not the U.S. Army. He's the governor of Indiana, and they lead an attack on Tippecanoe.
Yeah.
You know, and it's we call it an attack. It's really a massacre,
It was a different time, that's
right?
for sure. The governor just rides out and does this thing,
Right. And he wins the presidency on the slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," like
That's
it's a
right.
great thing,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
But that happens while Madison is
Oh,
coming into office.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And so the British, you mentioned earlier the idea that what happens is the British think we can't do anything about it. So what, we stayed. What are you going to
yeah, you can't. There's literally we could do nothing. In fact, while Washington's presidency, you have the Jay Treaty, which Americans are burning effigies of John Jay around the country
do? Hmm.
because it lets the British bloody our nose and keep doing it over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And but I think that the the war overall, it proves something though, um, to the British and to the rest of the world, and for this new nation too. The results of it,
No doubt, no doubt. I mean, it's the birth of nationalism. We
yeah.
didn't have that prior to 1812.
Hmm.
Um, they were
You would
still
think you would because of the Revolutionary War, but everybody sort of just.
well. You had the Articles of Confederation. We talked
Mhm.
about that, and we're going to have to talk about it. But um, they they had this loose union, and the idea was every state is sovereign. We band together for mutual defense, and that's really all it was.
Yeah,
Um, and with them being sovereign, they're separate. They're not unified in any way.
that's right.
And you start to get the patriotism and the songs and the flag, the War of 1812. That's
Yeah,
it. I mean, that's where, and by all intents and purposes, we were losing,
yeah,
but a couple of big wins and a couple of like the fact that the British are tired of fighting,
yeah.
you know,
Well, they were spending a lot of money.
it works off so
They're
well for
spending
us.
a lot of money, and because because really, what's the high points of the war? Because I don't think we should spin our wheels too much on it, but the high points of the war are what?
Well,
1812.
the Federalists call it Mr. Madison's War. They
Hmm.
literally blame him for it. But so do we want to talk about causes, or we want to get into the?
I think we get just like yeah. I mean, the causes is sort of what you've mentioned
Yeah, you've pretty much
previously.
got three of them. You've got the impressment of sailors,
Hmm.
the harassment of
Because
shipping,
it's a maritime problem.
right? You've got the harassment of shipping and the lack of trade,
Hmm.
and then you've got the Native Americans on the frontier.
That's
That's
right.
pretty much it.
Yeah, and so the British, to get their way, are inciting the Native Americans, saying, "Hey, we're with you," right?
Right,
Even though they were planning colonies here
right.
with,
To think that it's not
in the
an
beginning.
offensive war, though, yeah, it'd be wrong to think that because we invade Canada again.
That's true. You just can't seem to shake that
We
off.
had a couple of wins there,
Um,
but it didn't last.
no,
You know,
no, it just wasn't meant to be, I
right,
think. But this war, like again, it's really fought a lot against Native Americans, right? And
right.
that's, I think that maybe that.
What's not fought at sea or on the eastern seaboard, or one exception in New Orleans, is
Mhm.
Native Americans.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's this union of the British Empire and the Native American tribes as one unit, essentially,
right,
right? Fighting on all fronts at the same time.
right.
So this is a big deal. It's
Well,
one
we
thing if
we
you have an
also have to,
invasion from one side, but man, you've got, like you said, you've got maritime problems.
right.
You've got people randomly attacking and all of the
Well, and
colonies.
there's a major thing we cannot leave out of the picture is that it's part of the Napoleonic Wars.
Hmm.
So what you've got going on with Napoleon over in France and Russia and Waterloo eventually,
Yeah.
that's our War of 1812 is all part of that.
Hmm.
Ours is actually frontier backwoods compared to what's going on in Europe itself.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
a lot of that is the reason why we don't get the full brunt of the British assault because they're
Because
busy.
they have too many irons in the fire.
Yeah,
Right.
Wellington's over dealing with all
I
the
feel like that's what
Sophia.
happens too. Is like they feel like they just sort of they have to just call it. It's done. We got too much to deal with in other places,
Right,
because it's not like we were the only colony that there was a problem,
right.
or the only area that there was a problem. Europe was kind of wasn't stable
Right.
either.
It was unstable. I mean,
Yeah,
except in France where Napoleon made it pretty
that's right.
nice.
That's right. But the so the outcome really though of the war wasn't a win like for anybody.
It's
Uh,
seen as one though.
It's that's right.
It's
It's
seen
seen
as
as
one.
one, but it was a stalemate, right? Everybody just
Yeah.
like okay, because what the Treaty of Ghent does what
Status quo.
we go
Return
back,
to the status quo.
we go right back to whatever we were.
And so the impressment, which was the big issue, had already gone away before the war even starts because the British had revoked the Orders in Council,
Hmm.
which was making that happen in the first place.
That's right.
And so
It's
we fought a war over something that
that already ended.
they'd already ended.
Yeah, and so to make sure everybody understands what we're on here with the impressment. So if you would just stop a merchant ship, say from the U.S.,
Which was constantly happening.
that's correct. You could just take those people and say, "Oh, these are British citizens. You're in war. You're drafted into war,
Right.
essentially. You're a soldier now, or a sailor.
Sailor, you're in the middle
You're a
you're in the middle
sailor.
of the ocean. Your choice is to either do what they say or drown.
Yeah, yeah. You do it or die.
Right.
It's treason because you're a British citizen.
Right.
Because they still saw
Well, now, and
us as a
the
colony,
thing with
essentially.
that is the instances of impressment.
Hmm.
Most of the people they actually impress, they really were British citizens who had jumped ship.
Sure.
There's a few American citizens that get
Hmm.
shoved over or whatever.
Yeah, but
Um,
those people were working with the U.S. and so seen as too close for comfort,
yeah.
essentially.
The thing that takes the cake is when the HMS Leopard attacks and impresses the USS Chesapeake,
Hmm.
an actual Navy ship. That's when they kind of cross a line that I don't think anybody was coming back from. Now, that doesn't happen when Madison's president. Jefferson was still in office when that took place, but the
Yeah,
effect of that is super far-reaching.
sure.
So,
Hmm.
um, so I guess that's pretty good for causes.
Yeah.
I think we pretty much covered that. Um, we start talking about the highlights, if you will. Initially, we invade Canada. That's almost right off the bat. And there's some successes there. We get Detroit out of that deal. Tecumseh ends up dying at the Battle of Thames.
Hmm.
I don't know if they pronounce it Thames in Canada or not, but
I don't know either.
I think it's Thames River, just like it would be in London.
Hmm.
And there's that going on, but we eventually lose that. The Canadians push us out. It's not pretty.
Hmm.
There was a naval battle, one on the Great Lakes, the Battle of Lake Erie, and that was sort of a big deal because we thwarted British naval presence on the Great Lakes, which gave us in a sense, a wall
Hmm.
that prevented their invasion from the north.
Yeah.
So that's an important
Yeah.
thing. That's
Because that geography
right.
with the presence of ships, you're done. You're not coming that way.
Right. And it's a small win, but I think it's a morale affecting win.
Sure.
And
But
then you
But I mean, in the early 1800s, so you think about it this way too, because of the nature of like roads and such,
right. There's
which
no
are
roads.
they're pretty much
The
non-existent,
water
right?
is the road.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, if you're moving an army, it's difficult to do. And if you were by yourself, I know to go from New York to New Orleans took about six
Oh
weeks.
yeah, that was a major undertaking.
6 weeks overland.
Now, if you could get to the Mississippi, it's a matter of days.
Yes.
Yeah.
But 6 weeks by land.
Right.
Okay. Well, then the problem is if you're moving in an army, it takes longer than that.
Right.
Right. And if you're like we said, if you captured the Great Lakes, you've got the Northeast, and if they have to come around all the way from the other end, you're talking about months of
Right.
of travel with provisions and all the other.
Yeah.
That's
The
it makes it
interior,
almost impossible.
yeah, the interior is saved by that.
Yeah, it's over.
Yeah.
It's over at that point. Then you only really have, you know, places that are port cities, say like New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, and then okay, so the next thing would be after Napoleon surrenders at Waterloo, the British are able to divert forces our way, and they immediately go for the jugular.
Hmm.
They attack Fort McHenry, Baltimore, trying to get into the Chesapeake,
Hmm.
and eventually Washington, D.C. itself.
Yeah.
And that's a major morale draw is that
Mhm.
Madison has to flee the White House.
Yeah.
They set it all on fire.
Hmm.
Dolly Madison's famous for saving the painting of George Washington and other
Right.
things. Documents were told. Um, there's an interesting story about how the Declaration was saved and all that sort of thing. Um, but that looks pretty bad. I
Yeah.
mean, if you looked at that from
Well, you
that
come in, you
angle,
burn all the government buildings.
right? And you've got a group up in the Federalist regions, Massachusetts and stuff. They are sending their own envoys to Belgium and places like that to discuss a peace treaty. In fact, that's largely the reason why the war ends before the last battle's fought, because it's it's not even the main people in Washington sending the envoys to discuss the peace.
Right.
The Federalists were tired of fighting a war that was being fought over commerce,
Yeah.
and they they
Yeah.
took their own hand in that. They there was essentially a bid for New England to even secede from the Union, which is kind of an interesting
Yeah.
precedent for what we look
That's
at later.
correct. That's correct.
And then so that I guess we'd have to fast forward. You had Andrew Jackson fighting the Creek War down in Alabama,
Hmm.
and his troops eventually end up near New Orleans, and then you have the Battle of New Orleans that takes place January 1815. It's actually 2 weeks after the war had actually officially ended that the
Hmm.
battle it's over and done with.
Yeah. But and then that's his claim to fame essentially
Well,
too.
Jackson, absolutely, yeah, he's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Which, in that case, I don't give the credit to William Henry Harrison for Tippecanoe, because that's not really a
Yeah.
to me that's not really a
It doesn't
heroic
seem
win.
like a no. They're going in to
New Orleans,
massacre people.
New Orleans is a big deal.
No,
That
that's a war.
he wins that, and he does it well, and he does it with a melange of troops. But
Mhm.
we'll save that for Jackson
Yeah.
himself.
Well,
Um,
and I think that, especially New Orleans, with what happens there, and the other stuff is important too. But I think especially with New Orleans, what it showed is that wait a minute, we're not just a pushover.
right.
We just stood up and stalemated
Well, we thwarted a major
the
advance.
the
Yeah.
largest, most impressive military in the world at the
Right.
moment.
Right.
We just stopped a world empire
Yeah.
and said
Which a lot would say that about the revolution too.
it
But
is, but not quite the same because we didn't have anything to follow it up,
right.
right? And then,
Right.
but we were sufficiently advanced enough from, as you said, from 1808 or 1809
Right.
to the point by the end of the war in 1815 that this was we weren't to be messed with at that
Oddly
point.
enough, we have to go back and give some credit to John Adams for that,
Mhm.
for having created the U.S.
The
Navy,
Navy,
and
yeah,
because a lot of the War of 1812 is literally
which was there for a different reason, but
right.
yeah,
It's literally the Navy. I mean, the
hmm
Navy is doing amazing things out at sea.
yeah,
Um, Americans had learned to build faster and better armored ships than the British had.
hmm
So even though the British have the greatest navy in the world, our tactics are winning out.
yeah,
Um, the USS Constitution, I mean, it's a big deal, right? I
hmm
mean, and we're talking about the ship now, of
yeah,
course. Um, it's sailing around out there, sees two masts on the horizon, it runs away. But one attacks every time.
it
Um,
knows it knows when to pick a
Yeah, it
battle.
knows when to pick a fight, and it's faster. So
Yeah.
we're actually winning against the British Navy. It's a pretty impressive thing.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think you have to give some credit to Adams for that, because he got that ball rolling.
Well, so let's move out of that war. What are some other? Because I want to talk about something that actually happens in 1815, but we don't have the effects of it until 1816.
Some of the domestic things.
Yeah, so
Okay.
sort of the rest of his presidency, whatever, but or any other things that maybe stand out in his presidency. But so, you said January 1815, right? Well, a few months later, I think it's in June of 1815, Mount Tambora erupted.
Okay.
Okay. And
Just the one that spreads the ash cloud around the world?
it does, and it lowered
Temperatures.
global temperatures 1 degree Fahrenheit on average, which doesn't sound like much, right? Like, who cares about 1 degree? Well,
Kind of a big deal.
it was a huge deal. In fact, 1816 is known as the year without a summer.
Hmm.
So, New England, they were trying to at the end of March, the ground was still frozen solid. They couldn't plant.
Hmm.
Then it finally defrosts enough where they can plant. Well, as soon as it comes up, it's killed by frost. And this continues to happen over and over again. At the end of May, hard frost again. June 6th, they get like 18 inches in New York.
Well, that's pretty far south considering
Considering
weather-wise.
weather-wise, in New York in June, 18 inches of snow. Um,
Okay, now
and
you just blew my mind.
yes,
June.
and then and the rest of June was sort of okay, but July and August it was common to have lows in the 40s,
Wow.
and there was frosts again starting on August 22nd.
Hmm.
It was known as the year again without a summer, and this just affected the northern hemisphere. It only affected Europe and the U.S.
Right.
essentially, and some parts of Canada. Okay, but
Well, it must have been pretty bad in
it was
Europe
bad.
considering how far north they are
Europe
compared
ended
to
up
us.
with riots in the
So
streets.
England itself probably was
England had a
significant.
problem, and so this is right after the war,
Right.
right? And Germany, there were riots in the streets because there were no food. About 100,000 people died from famine and other problems. Okay, but massive crop failures. The If you look at the writings at the time, they talk about the color of the sky was different. It was shaded differently.
Hmm.
It was just blocking the sun out with ash and soot and stuff that had gone up so
Wow.
high up into the atmosphere.
Just
Um,
thinking of the biblical connotations that people would have drawn on.
yeah, well, later that, yeah, and I know, and then so later that year, actually, Madison addresses the nation essentially, Congress. He addresses Congress about this issue after the fact, and the U.S. actually came out okay, and it was because he says providence. Providence was on our side. He used the word God, but he uses the word providence was on our side. And we have, he said,
They've always put a capital P. So
correct. And there was such a varied amount or varied types of terrain and climates in the U.S. that we produced more food than we needed even in that year. So it was okay. Even though there were absolute complete crop failures all the way down to New York. From New York North, it was not, it's over. There was
right.
no way you couldn't grow anything. In he taught people talked about it as not 1816, but 18 and 18 and froze to death. That was what people were calling the year.
It's
I'm sure people had a lot of names
like
for
the 2016 Snowmageddon.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, or 2020, whatever people were calling the COVID thing. But it was called 1800 and froze to death,
Oh,
and
my.
people were noted at saying that, and so this was during Madison's presidency too. So the war ends, everything starts to move ahead, and they were still able to recover enough.
So what year is Monroe elected?
It is
18?
1817.
17. Okay, so it's a final year, essentially the final year of
That's
Madison's
right.
presidency.
Yeah, the final year of his presidency.
Now, not that he couldn't have run again, but he chooses to follow the Washington tradition.
That's right. Yeah. So they recover from the Mount Tambora thing, and he doesn't know what nobody knows what's going on. They're like, we don't know why this happened.
Surely Jefferson was taking note.
Oh, I'm sure we don't know why this happened, but we do know that we had enough. Providence has given us enough to survive, and they did know what was happening in Europe. They knew about that and the terribleness that was happening at that moment. In fact, if somebody wanted to, you could have taken advantage of several countries in Europe at that moment. Germany, for one, because of the terribleness of what was happening there. It was so bad. But yeah, they are more north, and it was more of a problem for
Right.
them. But it really didn't affect Asia
Right.
for some reason.
Probably the
Even
the
though Tambora's
eastern
in
coast.
Tambora's in the West Indies,
Yeah.
but just the way that the climate shifted and it altered weather patterns, and there was torrential downpours and very cold weather, all over in Europe and in the U.S.
Hmm.
But anyway, again, no, by the next spring, things had returned to normal. The It had begun to fall out by that point, and things essentially returned to normal. But
Leading right into the era of good feelings.
that's right.
Yep.
That's right. But so that was at the close of his presidency. I mean, that was probably an absolute shocker, though. Can you imagine you know, but you wake up at the end of May and frost has killed all of your crops,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know,
it would
and that happened
liken,
all the way down to South
yeah, it
Carolina.
would liken into February of 2020, where, all of a sudden everything's shut down.
Yeah,
It would definitely feel that way.
or snow in June,
Right.
you know,
That's wild.
absolutely, well, and not just a little bit of snow,
In New
like
York in
snow,
June. Yeah, that's
snow.
crazy.
So yeah, it froze the U.S. right, and so I guess what I'm getting at is that Madison is dealing with, he could have he dealt with a lot of things that were a real crisis.
Right. In my opinion, this is my opinion, Madison should be on Rushmore. I think largely because he has to deal with so many negatives is
Hmm.
probably the reason he's not.
Hmm.
But when we get to thinking about who he is in terms of the founding of the country,
Yeah,
what he deals with as president, there's some accomplishment there that we're not recognizing.
yeah.
Um, and
Well,
I
I mean, the
think
Constitution by itself is such a,
it's a big deal.
well, not only the Constitution, you know,
The Bill of Rights,
yeah, the Bill of Rights, but also the War of 1812,
the whole region.
because that solidified the U.S. as an actual
Power.
nation.
Yeah,
We were a real power, and they had to, at that point, from that point moving forward,
right.
respect
Our
what we
relationship
said.
with Great Britain completely changes.
But
Right.
I think that also sets up, though, what happens with the next president. And
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
really does
Yeah.
for his
He's able
positions
to do what we're fixing to talk about with that. He's able to do it.
because of the outcome of the war.
Really technically couldn't back it up, but he's able to do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you think that stands out about Madison?
As president, it's going to be a little more difficult, but going back to talking about his views as a federalist to an anti-federalist and
Mhm.
the creation of the Constitution, the founding of the country, all of those sorts of things, I think those do have some more bearing on what we're
Mhm.
aiming at with what his faith was.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And so what do we do with him at the end of the day? And because he was very reserved about expressing personal convictions.
right.
He shunned those. He did not answer
I think
when
we're going
people
to
asked those questions.
fall on the idea that Madison, of all of the group, save maybe Jefferson, is the most classically educated.
Yeah.
Um,
So
John
so
Adams is
I
surely
think he,
educated, but
sure, but not in the same way. And I think so. Maybe then he's more similar to Jefferson than some of the others.
I mean, when he's founding the country, when he's looking at that document, he's looking at Greece, he's looking at Rome, he's looking at
Hmm.
Britain, he's reading Montesquieu.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the things he's tying together. Totally a student of statehood
Yeah.
and what it takes to be a good statesman.
Yeah. And I feel like that his refusal to engage the public with personal religious views almost puts a nice little bow on his idea of religious freedom,
Right.
because I
The
don't have
freedom to think what I want.
I don't have to answer to anybody
Right.
for what I believe or what I think. And that's the way that he treated those questions. And I think that legacy is an important one,
It is.
and it expresses in reality what the words on the page were,
Right.
what he believed about religious freedom.
So you mentioned Elijah Craig with Madison,
Hmm.
and we've mentioned Leland with Jefferson, but Leland affects Madison just as much.
He does.
In fact, I think some of the
Well, he's Leland.
antagonism,
Leland is like,
yeah, like the running against him for
I'll run
office
against you for
and
office, buddy.
things like that. That's Madison he's doing that to,
That's right.
not
That's
Jefferson.
correct.
Um, and so yeah, I think you would definitely have to look into the relationship between Leland and Madison as well,
Yeah.
because that's a huge thing.
Yeah. So it's hard to pin him down, honestly, because he doesn't, like I said, he doesn't say. I don't think that he was where Jefferson was.
No,
Um,
I would think
but
more Christian by nature than Jefferson.
yeah,
Not completely, but
right. But I think he's more secular than, say, obviously than Witherspoon or somebody like that. He's more secular than many would want him to be at the time.
Secular is a good word for
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
he's more religious, or he's more spiritual that I think than Jefferson.
Yeah.
So he's somewhere in there, and I do think that he has Christianity as a foundational belief.
And that's a good way to characterize what we were talking about earlier with Jefferson.
Hmm.
Jefferson starts out more spiritual and kind
Yeah,
of goes away from it.
yeah, I think so. I think so. And I feel like we don't really know what Madison thought growing up, right?
True.
Because you had to be Anglican, whatever. He went through
Well,
the
he's on
motions and did his thing.
essentially at some point being in the Shenandoah area. He's closer to the frontier.
Yeah.
And so I think that has an effect too as you get further and away from the bigger cities
Hmm.
and out into the countryside.
He's exposed to more ideas.
The church behaves differently in that area
It
too.
does.
You know,
Yeah, he's exposed to more ideas, and I think I think like Jefferson, I think he appreciated the ability to be able to discuss ideas, spiritual in nature or government or whatever, freely. I think
right?
he wanted to be able to talk about it,
Yeah,
regardless of what he thought. He should be able to. I think he felt like he should be able to say if he wanted to,
right.
you know. And then while he was president, though, I feel like he doesn't engage on purpose to separate that out because he was the head of this organization.
We've not gotten to the point yet where we have a president that didn't know Washington. I
That's
think that's
correct.
a big deal too. I think Washington's precedent of doing that same thing
Hmm.
has sweeping
It
on
does.
all of these that we've talked about.
Yeah, and I think that he likely leaned on what Washington did
And
too.
Madison had a pretty good relationship with Washington,
Hmm.
like having been the guy that actually secured him for the um, convention. He was
Yeah,
instrumental in getting Washington to the convention. So,
yeah,
you know,
and so it's sort of he's sort of an odd one in there to categorize him. But I feel like his largest, again, that contribution is the idea of religious freedom of religious expression in that sense,
right,
without the government telling you that you can or can't believe that thing or say that thing or print that thing or whatever. I think that's his. He carved the path to allow people to, as what people would say today, freely exchange ideas,
right,
right? Which I feel like is still a core principle in the American ideal. That idea that we can talk about things, whether we agree about them or not, we can talk about them and it's okay.
right.
And that's Madison.
Yeah,
And I think for that reason by itself, he probably should be on Rushmore.
yeah. I mean, I can't think of anyone you would take off of Rushmore,
No,
but I think that, yeah, I think he's definitely someone that
yeah.
fits in with the ones that are there.
Hmm. As we move through this, you're going to find some that are more, I think, overtly religious or more spiritual. Some of them were just actually overtly more religious, and then others who are the other direction.
When I
Um,
think when we're looking at the first seven, though, and you use the word secular,
yeah.
it's a very good way to describe it because they see themselves as secular statesmen,
Hmm. Not as churchmen,
which their
and then
church, their
and
church side, whatever it may be, takes a back seat.
yeah,
You know, it's
when
the
they're in that role, I feel like it's like this role is not the same as, if I'm a deacon or I'm
right,
whatever, or a vestryman in the Anglican Church or whatever I am.
right,
That's a different role, and at this moment, I have to fulfill this role, this oath, this office.
which is an egalitarian kind of unifier.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
how are you going to unify everybody from A to Z on the religious spectrum if you're decidedly in one camp?
yeah, yeah,
It's kind of hard to do.
yeah. And it's kind of and especially if you went through all that hard fighting to get where you are, to then lay your cards on the table in front of everyone which hasn't been very long in the nation yet, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, all these different states are angry at you, you
That's an
know.
interesting point of fact that we did not yet bring up also is that, what were these guys doing during the revolution?
Hmm.
Washington obviously is leading the troops.
Yeah.
John Adams working as Congress and then eventually France, going to France.
Hmm.
Not any fighting on his part necessarily, but
No, but
um,
negotiations,
yeah,
ambassador.
he's diplomacy type things.
Hmm.
Jefferson, governor of Virginia, there's a noted story about how he sort of escapes the British. It's kind of an interesting thing. No fighting at all there. So there would some that would be labeling him a coward, so to speak.
Uh,
Madison, on the other hand, is old enough to fight in the war, but so sickly that he can't. Um,
yeah.
and that I
He'd
guess
been the
goes.
one that could have been in the
He
military,
gets
but
over
wasn't
those
allowed to
things.
be because
Yeah,
of some profile.
and he's busy writing while that's happening. So some of that, I can't remember what the point was that
So
to
there's
make.
some usefulness that happens there then
Yeah,
because he's thinking,
yeah,
and his thinking leads to the state of things to come, the
right,
Virginia Constitution and the Constitution of the United States, and how these things were going to be worked out,
right,
and so he had a different role to play,
right.
and I think he filled that role well,
But I think
you know.
looking at the text of the First Amendment and how it's worded,
Hmm.
and we say it's drawn from the Virginia statute, which is Jefferson. But when you look at how Madison crafted that,
Yeah.
all the details are there. Everything that needs to be there. You have a separation clause. You have a free exercise clause.
Hmm.
Really, who could ask for anything more on
Yeah.
that? I mean,
You
it's
need to be able to say what you want, print what you want, all the rest,
right,
And he, like I said, he had literally saw people that were jailed for printing things that other people didn't agree with,
right,
you know. Um, and for that matter, even in places where there is sort of freedom that's similar, say Great Britain, for instance, we want to go back and talk about them, but they're, I mean, like their libel laws are way more in favor of being able to sue and win libel suits than you can in the US. You have more ability to speak and to say things, even if they're defamatory,
right,
depending on the situation.
right.
Um, you
Would
know,
depend on how you're defaming someone.
correct.
Yeah,
But anyway, like I said, the whole foundation of everything is different.
right.
And it was thought of by these guys, and Madison has one of the largest roles to play in all that.
Yeah, he's the architect
That's right.
all the way.
So, so I want to put a bow on Madison, and
Okay,
we'll move on and talk about James Monroe.
okay.
So, all right. So, if you like what you heard, guys, please hit the like, subscribe button. See you guys next time.